I thought being a devoted mother and building my children's futures would guarantee love and respect in return. Instead, I found myself banished to a damp basement, sleeping on a pull-out couch while strangers occupied my own bedroom upstairs. My 3 successful children had decided I was nothing more than a burden, a relic from their past that needed to be hidden away like damaged furniture. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What they didn't know was that I had just inherited a technology empire worth $47 million from my brilliant sister Eleanor. But I wasn't going to reveal that secret just yet. I had far more interesting plans brewing, plans that would show them exactly what happens when you treat family like disposable trash. My name is Victoria Hawthorne, and at 67 years old, I never imagined I would be sharing a story about how my own flesh and blood transformed me from matriarch to prisoner in my own home. The house I had painstakingly restored brick by brick. The gardens I had cultivated for 3 decades. The rooms filled with memories of birthday parties and family celebrations. All of it had become my cage. But sometimes the most devastating betrayals lead to the most extraordinary reversals of fortune. The transformation began on a crisp October morning in Riverside Heights, Colorado, when the autumn leaves painted the Rocky Mountain foothills in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. I was in my kitchen preparing what I thought would be a pleasant family breakfast when I heard the familiar sound of expensive cars pulling into my circular driveway. Through the window, I watched my eldest son Marcus emerge from his pristine black Tesla, adjusting his designer suit with the practiced efficiency of someone perpetually late for important meetings. Diana followed in her silver Mercedes, her surgical scrubs visible beneath her cashmere coat, clearly having worked another overnight shift at Mountain View Medical Center. Christopher arrived last in his flashy red sports car, the kind of vehicle that announced his success in real estate development to anyone within a 5-block radius. My heart lifted with genuine joy as I watched them approach the front door together. It had been months since all 3 of my children had visited simultaneously, and I assumed they were planning some kind of family celebration, or perhaps had wonderful news to share. I quickly set additional places at the mahogany dining table that had been the centerpiece of countless family gatherings over the years. The morning sunlight streamed through the bay windows, illuminating the crystal glasses and fine china that I still used for special occasions, even when dining alone. Marcus was the first to speak when they entered, his voice carrying that peculiar tone of forced cheerfulness that people use when delivering unwelcome news. "Mother, we need to have a serious conversation about your living situation." The words hit me like a physical blow, though I managed to maintain my composure while gesturing for them to sit down. At 42, Marcus had inherited his father's commanding presence and business acumen, building a successful corporate consulting firm that served Fortune 500 companies across the western United States. His expensive suits and platinum watch spoke of financial success, but his eyes held the cold calculation of someone who viewed everything, including family relationships, through the lens of cost-benefit analysis. Diana, my only daughter, possessed the focused intensity that made her one of the most respected cardiac surgeons in the state. At 39, she had achieved everything she had ever dreamed of professionally, but somewhere along the way, she had lost the warmth and empathy that had once defined her personality. Her medical training had taught her to make difficult decisions based on logic rather than emotion, a skill that apparently extended to family matters as well. She sat rigidly in her chair, already checking her smartwatch as if this conversation was merely another item on her packed schedule. Christopher, my youngest at 35, had always been the most charming and manipulative of my children. His success in real estate development came largely from his ability to convince people to see situations from his perspective, to make them believe that his proposals were actually in their best interests. He had inherited my late husband's easy smile and persuasive manner, but he wielded these gifts with a ruthlessness that would have horrified his father. We settled around the dining room table where I had taught them table manners, helped them with homework, and celebrated every milestone of their young lives. The irony was not lost on me that this same table was about to become the setting for what felt like a tribunal judging my worthiness to remain in my own home. Marcus spread several documents across the polished wood surface, while Diana consulted a tablet filled with what appeared to be medical reports and financial projections. "Mother," Diana began, her voice taking on the clinical tone she used with difficult patients. "We've been consulting with elder care specialists and financial advisors about the best way to ensure your safety and well-being as you age." The word elder care stung more than I had expected. When had I become someone who needed care rather than someone capable of providing it? I had raised these 3 human beings as a single mother after their father died in a skiing accident. When they were teenagers, working multiple jobs to pay for their educations and support their ambitions. Christopher leaned forward with his practiced salesman's smile. "The thing is, Mom, this house is getting too big for you to manage alone. The maintenance costs are enormous, and frankly, it's not safe for someone your age to be rattling around in all this space." I looked around the room that I had personally decorated, remembering the countless hours I had spent selecting every piece of furniture, every artwork, every decorative detail. This wasn't just a house to me. It was the physical manifestation of a lifetime of dreams and memories. Marcus pulled out a glossy brochure featuring photographs of smiling elderly people engaged in various activities. "We found this amazing continuing care community called Golden Sunset Village. It's only 30 minutes from the city, and they have incredible amenities, fitness centers, social activities, medical care on site." He spoke as if he was presenting a vacation resort rather than discussing uprooting me from everything I held dear. "And the best part," Diana added with what she probably thought was enthusiasm, "is that it would free up your equity in this house to pay for your care. The real estate market is incredibly strong right now, and Christopher thinks we could get top dollar." The casual way she discussed selling my home, as if it were merely a commodity to be liquidated, made my blood run cold. They had already calculated the profits from dismantling my life. I studied their faces carefully, searching for any sign of the children I had raised, the young people who had once depended on me for everything from scraped knee comfort to college tuition payments. Marcus, whom I had supported through business, school by working extra shifts at the accounting firm where I had spent 20 years climbing from receptionist to senior partner. Diana, whose medical school expenses I had covered by taking out a second mortgage on this very house. Christopher, whose first real estate ventures I had funded with my retirement savings, believing in his potential when no bank would take the risk. "I see," I said quietly, fighting to keep my voice steady. "And I suppose you've already made arrangements for this transition." The guilty expressions that flickered across their faces told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a discussion. It was a notification of decisions already made. Christopher shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Well, we did put down a deposit at Golden Sunset Village just to hold a spot. The waiting list is quite long, and we didn't want to miss this opportunity." The word opportunity struck me as particularly cruel. My displacement had become their opportunity. "We've also spoken with a real estate agent," Marcus continued, seemingly oblivious to my growing distress. "The market analysis suggests we could list the house within the next month or 2. The timing is perfect." Perfect for whom? I wondered silently. Diana looked up from her tablet with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news to patients. "In the meantime, we thought it would be best if you moved into the basement apartment. It's completely self-contained, and you'll still be in familiar surroundings while we prepare for the transition." The basement? Apartment was a space I had converted years ago for visiting relatives, complete with a small kitchenette, bathroom, and sitting area. It was comfortable enough for short stays, but the idea of being relegated to the lowest level of my own home felt like a symbolic burial. The movers are coming next week to put most of your furniture into storage, Christopher added matter-of-factly. We'll keep the essentials, of course, but there's really no point in holding on to everything when you'll be downsizing so dramatically. My furniture, collected over decades of careful selection and precious memories, was about to become storage. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The afternoon wore on as they presented their comprehensive plan for dismantling my existence. They had researched continuing care costs, spoken with financial advisors about liquidating my assets, and even contacted an estate sale company to handle my excess belongings. Every detail had been meticulously planned without any input from the person whose life was being reorganized. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the dining room, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. Not my love for them. That would take more than one afternoon to destroy, but something else entirely. My trust in their judgment, my faith in their character, my willingness to prioritize their comfort over my own dignity. These things began to crumble like autumn leaves falling from the trees outside. "Very well," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "If this is what you've decided, then I suppose I have no choice but to accept it." The relief on their faces was immediate and unmistakable. They had braced themselves for arguments, tears, or emotional manipulation. Instead, they got acquiescence from someone they had clearly underestimated. They didn't know that acceptance and submission were entirely different things. They didn't know that I had learned decades ago to choose my battles carefully and strike when victory was actually possible. Most importantly, they didn't know about the phone call I had received 2 weeks earlier from Patricia Reynolds, the family attorney handling my sister Eleanor's estate. Eleanor Blackwood had been the brilliant, eccentric sister who had never married or had children, devoting her entire life to building a technology empire that revolutionized data security systems for major corporations worldwide. While I had chosen the path of marriage and motherhood, Eleanor had chosen innovation and entrepreneurship, creating algorithms and software that protected the digital infrastructure of banks, hospitals, and government agencies across 3 continents. Eleanor had always been protective of me, especially after my husband's death left me struggling to raise 3 teenagers alone. She had offered financial help countless times over the years, but I had stubbornly insisted on independence, determined to prove that I could provide for my family without relying on her success. Eleanor had respected my pride, but she had also worried about my children's increasingly self-centered behavior as they achieved their own success. 2 weeks before my children's intervention, Patricia Reynolds had called with news that changed everything. Eleanor had died suddenly of a brain aneurysm while working late in her laboratory, and she had left her entire estate to me. Not just a generous inheritance, but the complete ownership of Blackwood Industries, including all patents, contracts, and assets valued at $47 million. The will included a personal letter that Patricia had read to me over the phone, Eleanor's final words written in her characteristic direct style. "Victoria, you've spent your entire life taking care of ungrateful people who take your sacrifices for granted. It's time you learned to take care of yourself. Use this money to demand the respect you've always deserved, but been too kind to require. Don't let them push you around anymore. Show them what happens when they underestimate the woman who gave them everything." Eleanor had seen what I had been too loving to acknowledge, that my children had gradually transformed from grateful recipients of my sacrifices into entitled adults who viewed my contributions as their birthright rather than gifts to be treasured. She had watched them become increasingly dismissive of my opinions, increasingly impatient with my needs, increasingly convinced that their success somehow diminished their obligations to the woman who had made their achievements possible. The letter continued with specific instructions about keeping the inheritance secret until I could use it strategically. Eleanor had anticipated that my children might try to control my life decisions, and she wanted me to have leverage when that moment arrived. She had been right about everything, including the timeline of their intervention. Over the following week, as my children orchestrated my exile to the basement with military precision, I maintained perfect composure while secretly consulting with Patricia Reynolds about the legal and financial possibilities my inheritance had created. The movers came and disappeared with my furniture, leaving me with a narrow bed, a small table, and a single chair in what had once been my guest quarters. My extensive library was boxed and labeled for storage. My artwork was wrapped and removed. My personal belongings were reduced to whatever could fit in 2 suitcases. Marcus hired a staging company to redecorate the main house with neutral furniture and generic artwork designed to appeal to potential buyers. Diana brought in a home inspector who identified dozens of minor repairs and improvements that needed to be completed before listing. Christopher coordinated with photographers and marketing specialists to create promotional materials showcasing the property's best features. Through it all, I remained in the basement, emerging only for meals and brief conversations about the progress of their various projects. They treated me with the kind of distant politeness usually reserved for elderly relatives whose presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. When friends called to check on me, they were told I was transitioning to a new living situation and wasn't available for extended conversations. The irony was breathtaking. My children were spending their days upstairs in my house, using my kitchen, entertaining their friends in my living room, making decisions about my future, while I lived like a displaced tenant in the basement. They had effectively reversed our relationship, transforming themselves into the homeowners, and me into the dependent relative they were graciously housing temporarily. But I wasn't just sitting in that basement feeling sorry for myself. I was planning. Every morning while they rushed off to their important jobs, I was on the phone with Patricia Reynolds, developing strategies that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in our family dynamic. Every evening while they celebrated their progress in handling the Victoria situation, I was researching property law, inheritance rights, and the specific vulnerabilities in their own financial situations. The basement became my war room, the place where I carefully constructed a response that would teach them the most valuable lesson of their adult lives. Never underestimate the woman who raised you, especially when you don't know what resources she has at her disposal. 3 weeks into my basement exile, I had completed my research and was ready to begin the most important campaign of my life. My children thought they had successfully contained and controlled me, reducing me to a manageable problem with a predetermined solution. They had no idea that their animal in the basement was actually the new owner of a technology empire worth more than all of their combined assets. They were about to learn that sometimes the people you underestimate the most are the ones with the power to change everything. And I was finally ready to show them exactly what kind of animal they had been dealing with all along. The morning after finalizing my strategy with Patricia Reynolds, I woke in that cramped basement feeling something I hadn't experienced in months, complete control over my destiny. For the first time since my children had relegated me to the lowest level of my own home, I felt like Victoria Hawthorne again, the woman who had built a successful accounting career from nothing, who had raised 3 children as a widowed mother, who had quietly supported Eleanor's technology ventures with business advice when the brilliant inventor needed guidance on financial management. I dressed carefully in my best navy suit, the one I had worn to important client meetings during my corporate days. As I climbed the stairs to what had once been my kitchen, I could hear the familiar sounds of my children preparing for their busy days. Marcus was on a conference call with investors, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he used when closing major deals. Diana was reviewing patient files while grabbing a quick breakfast between hospital rounds. Christopher was studying market reports on his laptop, probably identifying new properties to flip for maximum profit. They barely acknowledged my presence as I moved through the kitchen, treating me like background noise in their important lives. This dismissive behavior that had once hurt me deeply now served my purposes perfectly. They were so accustomed to overlooking me, that they had no idea I was conducting business that would fundamentally alter everything they thought they knew about our family dynamics. The first phase of my plan required establishing control over Blackwood Industries, the technology empire Eleanor had built over 3 decades of relentless innovation. Patricia had arranged a meeting with Samuel Chen, the company's longtime business manager who had worked closely with Eleanor to develop the corporate structure that protected her intellectual property and managed contracts with major clients worldwide. I took the city bus downtown to the sleek glass tower that housed Blackwood Industries headquarters, a building I had visited only occasionally during Eleanor's lifetime. Walking through the marble lobby filled with displays of cutting-edge technology and awards for innovation, I felt both pride in my sister's achievements and anticipation for what these resources could accomplish in the right hands. Samuel Chen turned out to be a sharp-minded professional in his 50s who had genuinely respected Eleanor both personally and professionally. He greeted me in the executive conference room with a mixture of condolence and curiosity, clearly wondering how Eleanor's sister would handle inheriting such a complex business enterprise. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said, consulting the thick folder of documents Patricia had prepared, "I want you to understand the scope of what Eleanor has left. Blackwood Industries isn't just a company. It's the foundation of digital security for hundreds of major corporations. Your sister's algorithms protect banking systems, medical records, government databases, and corporate communications across multiple industries." As Samuel explained the various revenue streams, patent portfolios, and contract obligations, I began to grasp the true magnitude of Eleanor's legacy. This wasn't simply a large inheritance that would provide financial security for my remaining years. This was an empire that generated millions of dollars annually while providing essential services that major institutions couldn't function without. "The board of directors has been running day-to-day operations since Eleanor's death," Samuel continued. "But they need direction from the owner about long-term strategy, major contracts, and expansion plans. Several Fortune 500 companies have approached us about developing new security protocols, and there are acquisition offers from larger technology firms that we need to evaluate." I studied the financial reports, contract summaries, and strategic analyses that Samuel spread across the conference table. My accounting background helped me understand the numbers, but more importantly, I could see the leverage these resources represented. Blackwood Industries wasn't just wealthy. It was powerful in ways that could influence the business community where my children had built their careers. "Samuel," I said, settling back in the leather chair at the head of the conference table, "I need you to prepare comprehensive reports on several local businesses. I want to understand their financial health, their client relationships, and their vulnerabilities." I handed him a list that included Marcus's consulting firm, the medical center where Diana worked, and Christopher's real estate development company. Samuel's eyebrows rose slightly, but his professional discretion prevented him from asking questions about my motivations. "Of course, Mrs. Hawthorne. May I ask what level of detail you're looking for in these reports?" "Everything," I replied. "Contract dependencies, major clients, debt obligations, regulatory compliance issues, competitive pressures. I want to understand these businesses better than their owners do." Samuel nodded and made notes, clearly recognizing that the new owner of Blackwood Industries was planning something significant. Over the following week, while my children continued their preparations for selling my house and relocating me to Golden Sunset Village, I immersed myself in learning about the technology empire I now controlled. Samuel arranged meetings with department heads, key clients, and strategic partners who wanted to understand Eleanor's successor and ensure continuity in their business relationships. The more I learned about Blackwood Industries, the more impressed I became with Eleanor's vision and execution. She hadn't just created valuable software. She had built an ecosystem of relationships and dependencies that made her company essential to major industries. Banks relied on Blackwood security protocols to protect customer data. Hospitals used Eleanor systems to safeguard patient records. Government agencies depended on her innovations to secure sensitive communications. More importantly for my immediate purposes, I discovered that several of Blackwood Industries' major clients had direct business relationships with my children's companies. Marcus's consulting firm had contracts with 3 banks that used Eleanor's security systems. Diana's medical center depended on Blackwood protocols to maintain regulatory compliance for patient data protection. Christopher's real estate company used Blackwood software to secure financial transactions and client information. The web of interconnections was even more extensive than I had initially realized. Samuel's research revealed that Marcus's firm was particularly vulnerable because their consulting contracts with financial institutions required them to maintain the highest levels of data security. If those banks decided to terminate their relationships due to security concerns, Marcus's business would lose approximately 60% of its revenue within 90 days. Diana's situation at the medical center was more complex, but equally precarious. The hospital's cybersecurity infrastructure was built entirely around Blackwood systems, and any disruption in service would trigger regulatory investigations that could jeopardize the institution's accreditation. As the head of cardiac surgery, Diana's position depended on the medical center's continued success and reputation. Christopher's real estate empire was built on leveraging relationships with investors and financial institutions, most of whom used Blackwood security systems to protect their digital assets. His ability to secure funding for new developments depended on maintaining credibility with these partners, credibility that could evaporate if questions arose about his professional integrity or family stability. As I absorbed this information, from my basement exile, listening to my children make plans for my future upstairs, I felt a growing sense of anticipation. They had reduced me to a problem to be solved, a burden to be managed, an inconvenience to be relocated. They had no idea that their problem now controlled technology systems that their own success depended on. The irony was delicious. While they spent their evenings in my living room discussing real estate strategies and calculating profits from selling my home, I was in the basement below them, planning strategies that could reshape their entire professional lives. They thought they held all the power in our family dynamic, but they were about to discover that power, real power, comes from controlling things that others need. 3 weeks into my basement imprisonment, I was ready to begin the next phase of my plan. Samuel had prepared detailed analyses of my children's businesses, identifying specific vulnerabilities and pressure points that could be leveraged if necessary. Patricia had helped me establish legal structures that would allow me to exercise influence while maintaining plausible distance from any negative consequences my children might experience. The beauty of my position was that I didn't need to actively sabotage their businesses to create pressure. I simply needed to introduce uncertainty into their professional environments, to make them question the stability of relationships they had taken for granted. In the business world, uncertainty was often more damaging than direct attacks because it forced people to waste energy on defensive measures rather than focusing on growth and success. My first move was subtle but strategically significant. Through Samuel, I arranged for Blackwood Industries to begin a comprehensive review of all client security protocols, ostensibly to ensure compliance with new federal regulations that were being discussed in Congress. This review process would require detailed documentation from client companies about their business relationships, financial stability, and long-term strategic plans. The banks that contracted with Marcus's consulting firm would receive questionnaires asking about their relationships with third-party service providers, including specific questions about the security and reliability of those relationships. While the review was presented as routine compliance verification, the questions were designed to make bank executives consider whether their consulting arrangements met the highest standards of professional integrity. Diana's medical center would face similar scrutiny regarding their administrative partnerships and the people who had access to sensitive patient information. The hospital's compliance department would receive detailed requirements about background checks and family stability assessments for staff members who worked with protected health data. Christopher's real estate investors would be asked to verify the integrity and financial stability of their development partners, with particular attention to any potential conflicts of interest or family situations that might compromise professional judgment. None of these reviews directly targeted my children or made specific accusations about their character or competence. Instead, they created an environment where their business partners would begin asking questions about relationships they had previously taken for granted. The goal wasn't immediate destruction, but gradual erosion of confidence that would force my children to work harder to maintain their professional standing. While implementing these subtle pressures, I also began preparing for more direct action if my children continued their plan to relocate me against my will. Patricia helped me establish a family trust structure that would allow me to support my children financially, while maintaining control over the terms and conditions of that support. The trust could provide significant benefits for Marcus, Diana, and Christopher, but only if they demonstrated the kind of respect and consideration that I had been trying to teach them their entire lives. The trust documents included specific provisions about family relationships, requiring beneficiaries to maintain regular, meaningful contact with the trust administrator, namely me. There were also clauses about housing arrangements, specifying that the trust could not provide benefits to anyone who had forced elderly family members to live in substandard conditions against their will. Most importantly, the trust structure gave me the ability to redirect my inheritance away from my children entirely if they continued treating me as a burden rather than a beloved family member. Eleanor's fortune could establish scholarships for disadvantaged students, fund medical research, or support technology innovation programs. My children's inheritance was not guaranteed. It was dependent on their behavior. As October turned to November, the pressure of living in the basement while watching strangers redecorate my home began taking its toll on my physical health. But my mental state remained focused and determined. Every morning, I watched through the small basement window as real estate agents brought potential buyers to tour my property. Every afternoon, I listened to my children discuss price negotiations and closing timelines as if I weren't sitting 20 feet away from them. The emotional distance between us had grown so profound that they barely registered my presence during their family strategy sessions. They discussed my future living arrangements, my financial needs, and my healthcare requirements without asking for my input or considering my preferences. I had become a project they were managing rather than a person they loved. But while they planned my exile, I was orchestrating their education. The business reviews I had initiated were beginning to generate questions and concerns among their professional partners. Marcus received calls from banking clients asking about his firm's security protocols and long-term stability. Diana faced increased scrutiny from hospital administrators about her family situation and its potential impact on her professional performance. Christopher discovered that several investors were requesting additional documentation about his background and financial relationships. These pressures were designed to be puzzling rather than obviously threatening. My children couldn't point to any specific problem or identify any clear source of the increased scrutiny they were experiencing. Instead, they found themselves dealing with a general sense of unease in their professional environments, a feeling that relationships they had counted on were somehow becoming less reliable. The psychological impact was exactly what I had hoped. For, instead of focusing confidently on their careers while managing my relocation as a side project, they were being forced to spend time and energy shoring up professional relationships that seemed inexplicably fragile. The stress of these unexplained challenges made them irritable and distracted, which in turn made them less effective in their personal dealings with each other and with me. As the date for my move to Golden Sunset Village approached, I watched my children become increasingly tense and argumentative among themselves. Marcus snapped at Diana when she questioned his timeline for selling the house. Diana criticized Christopher's handling of the estate sale arrangements. Christopher complained that both of his siblings were being unreasonable about logistics and scheduling. The strain of managing multiple crises simultaneously was revealing the selfishness and impatience that had always lurked beneath their successful professional facades. When everything was going smoothly, they could afford to be generous and considerate with each other. When pressure mounted, their true characters emerged, and those characters were not particularly admirable. But I wasn't finished with them yet. The subtle business pressures and family trust preparations were just the foundation for what was coming next. My children had spent months treating me like a problem to be solved, and now they were about to discover that their problem had resources they had never imagined, and patience they had seriously underestimated. The basement where they had imprisoned me was about to become the command center for the most important lesson of their adult lives. They thought they were dealing with a helpless elderly woman who could be easily managed and controlled. They were about to learn that they were dealing with the owner of a technology empire who had finally decided to stop accepting unacceptable treatment from ungrateful children. The real confrontation was still to come, but the groundwork had been carefully laid. When the moment arrived for me to reveal the true balance of power in our family, my children would already be off balance, already questioning the stability of their professional lives, already vulnerable to the kind of shock that forces people to completely reassess their assumptions about the world around them. From my basement exile, I could hear them upstairs making final preparations for my departure, confident that they had successfully solved the Victoria problem. They had no idea that Victoria Hawthorne was just getting started, and that the problem they thought they had contained was about to become the force that would transform everything they thought they knew about power, family, and consequences. The first crack in my children's confident facade appeared on a frigid December morning, when Marcus burst into the kitchen looking like he hadn't slept in days. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled, and his hands shook slightly as he poured coffee with unnecessary force. Diana looked up from her medical journals with the sharp attention of someone trained to recognize distress signals in others. "What's wrong with you?" she asked, her tone carrying more irritation than concern. The stress of managing their respective professional challenges had made them less sympathetic to each other's problems, a dynamic I found both predictable and useful. Marcus slammed his coffee mug down harder than necessary, causing Diana to flinch. "Sterling Bank just terminated our consulting contract. No explanation, no discussion, just a formal letter citing strategic restructuring and thanking us for our service." His voice carried a bewilderment that would have concerned me deeply if I hadn't been the architect of his confusion. Christopher looked up from his laptop, where he had been reviewing property listings with diminishing enthusiasm. His own real estate deals had been experiencing mysterious delays and complications that were forcing him to spend significantly more time on projects that should have been routine transactions. "That doesn't make sense. Weren't they your biggest client?" 60% of our revenue, Marcus confirmed, running his hands through his hair with the desperate gesture of someone watching his carefully constructed world begin to crumble. "I've been calling everyone I know at Sterling trying to understand what happened, but no one will take my calls. It's like I've suddenly become toxic." Diana's phone buzzed, and she glanced at it with the automatic reflex of someone whose professional life demanded constant availability. Her expression shifted from casual interest in Marcus's problems to sharp concern about her own situation. "The hospital administration wants to see me this afternoon about compliance issues. They won't tell me what specific issues, just that there are questions about my departmental management that need to be addressed." I continued eating my breakfast in the corner of what had once been my kitchen, maintaining the invisible presence that had become my default mode during their family discussions. They spoke around me and over me as if I were a piece of furniture, which suited my purposes perfectly. The less attention they paid to my reactions, the less likely they were to connect their professional troubles to my newfound equanimity about living in the basement. Christopher closed his laptop with obvious frustration. "Something weird is happening with my investors, too. 3 different financing deals have fallen through in the past 2 weeks, and I can't get straight answers about why. It's like everyone suddenly decided I'm a bad risk, but no one will tell me what changed." The conversation that followed revealed just how effectively my subtle interventions were destabilizing their professional confidence. Marcus described increasingly paranoid theories about competitors sabotaging his business relationships. Diana, worried that hospital politics were being used against her by jealous colleagues. Christopher wondered if a disgruntled client was spreading rumors about his reliability among potential investors. None of them considered the possibility that their problems might be connected to each other, let alone to their treatment of their mother. They were so accustomed to viewing me as powerless and irrelevant that the idea of me having influence over their professional lives would have seemed absurd. This blind spot was both insulting and strategically valuable. As they continued their anxious discussion, I finished my breakfast and quietly retreated to the basement, where I had a conference call scheduled with Samuel Chen about the next phase of our strategy. The business reviews that Blackwood Industries had initiated were generating exactly the kind of uncertainty and concern I had hoped for, but now it was time to escalate the pressure more directly. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Samuel said when I connected to the secure video call, "the preliminary reviews have been quite effective. Your children's business partners are asking significantly more questions about their professional relationships and family stability. Several clients have requested additional documentation and background verifications that are creating substantial administrative burdens." I settled into the single chair that constituted my basement office, feeling a satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with finally being able to demand accountability from people who had taken my sacrifices for granted. "What about the more direct measures we discussed? Are we ready to implement those?" Samuel consulted his notes with the thoroughness that had made him invaluable to Eleanor during her empire-building years. "Yes, we've identified several specific pressure points that would create immediate consequences without leaving obvious fingerprints pointing back to Blackwood Industries or to you personally." The beauty of controlling a technology company that provided essential services to major industries was that influence could be exercised through seemingly routine business decisions. If Blackwood Industries decided to update security protocols or modify service agreements, client companies had very little choice but to comply or risk losing access to systems they couldn't function without. Marcus's consulting firm, for example, depended on their ability to assure banking clients that all data exchanges met the highest security standards. If the banks that used Blackwood security systems received notifications about enhanced compliance requirements that specifically addressed third-party consulting relationships, those banks would naturally scrutinize their existing consulting arrangements more carefully. Diana's medical center had built their entire patient data management system around Blackwood protocols. If those protocols were updated to include new requirements about staff background checks and family stability assessments, the hospital administration would have no choice but to implement those requirements or risk regulatory violations that could cost them millions in fines and damage their accreditation status. Christopher's real estate business relied on maintaining credibility with investors who used Blackwood systems to secure their financial transactions. If those investors received advisories about enhanced due diligence requirements for development partners, they would naturally become more cautious about approving new projects and more demanding about documentation and guarantees. "Implement the enhanced compliance protocols," I told Samuel. "Make sure the notifications go out this week, with implementation deadlines that require immediate attention from client companies." The timing was crucial because my children were already stressed about their unexplained professional difficulties. Additional pressure would prevent them from developing effective coping strategies or identifying the true source of their problems. Over the following days, I watched from my basement exile as the enhanced compliance requirements created exactly the kind of cascading pressure I had anticipated. Marcus received urgent calls from remaining bank clients demanding immediate documentation about his firm's security procedures and family stability protocols. Diana faced intensive questioning from hospital administrators about her background and personal circumstances. Christopher discovered that investor meetings he had counted on were being postponed indefinitely pending additional due diligence, reviews, The psychological impact was profound and immediate. My children, who had spent their entire adult lives building professional reputations based on competence and reliability, suddenly found themselves scrambling to prove their worthiness to clients and partners who had previously trusted them without question. The experience of being judged and found potentially wanting was entirely new to them, and they lacked the emotional resilience to handle it gracefully. Marcus became increasingly paranoid, convinced that competitors were orchestrating a coordinated attack on his business. He hired private investigators to research his rivals and spent thousands of dollars on enhanced security measures that did nothing to address the real source of his problems. His attempts to understand and counter threats that didn't actually exist consumed time and energy that would have been better spent maintaining relationships with the clients he still had. Diana's response was even more self-destructive. She interpreted the hospital's increased scrutiny as evidence that her colleagues were undermining her out of professional jealousy. She became defensive and combative in administrative meetings, creating real conflicts with people who had previously supported her career advancement. Her paranoid behavior was actually generating the kind of negative attention that could legitimately threaten her position. Christopher tried to solve his problems through more aggressive marketing and increasingly desperate attempts to secure alternative financing for his development projects. His efforts to compensate for lost investor confidence by taking on riskier deals and offering more favorable terms to reluctant partners actually made him appear less stable and reliable, creating a downward spiral that confirmed his potential. Clients' worst suspicions about his judgment. The most satisfying aspect of watching their professional struggles was seeing how quickly their veneer of successful sophistication disappeared under pressure. These children who had condescended to me about my inability to manage my own affairs were proving remarkably incompetent at managing theirs when faced with unexpected challenges. Marcus, who had lectured me about the importance of making practical decisions based on objective analysis, was making increasingly irrational choices based on conspiracy theories and wounded pride. Diana, who had insisted that my emotional reactions to their plans were inappropriate and counterproductive, was alienating colleagues with her own emotional volatility. Christopher, who had dismissed my concerns about their timeline as unrealistic resistance to necessary changes, was now demanding unrealistic accommodations from business partners who were becoming less tolerant of his desperation. As December progressed and the date for my relocation to Golden Sunset Village approached, my children's professional crises began affecting their personal relationship with each other and their handling of family logistics. The stress of dealing with unexplained business problems made them less patient with the details of managing my transition, which created opportunities for me to introduce additional complications into their carefully planned timeline. When the estate sale company arrived to inventory my possessions for auction, I mentioned to the representative that some items might have greater sentimental value than monetary worth, and perhaps family members should have the opportunity to claim specific pieces before they were sold to strangers. This innocent suggestion created hours of arguments among my children about who deserved which items and whether certain pieces should be preserved for future generations. Diana wanted my grandmother's china set, but Christopher argued that he was the only one with children who might eventually appreciate such heirlooms. Marcus insisted that my collection of first-edition books should be appraised more carefully before being sold, but Diana complained that storing books indefinitely was impractical and expensive. Each sibling suspected the others of trying to claim the most valuable items while sticking them with the expenses and responsibilities of managing less desirable possessions. These arguments about my belongings revealed the depth of selfishness and mutual distrust that had always existed beneath their facade of family unity. When everything was going smoothly, they could afford to be generous with each other. When pressure mounted, their true priorities emerged, and those priorities centered entirely on their own interests rather than on our collective family welfare. The moving company that was supposed to transport my belongings to Golden Sunset Village encountered a series of scheduling conflicts and logistical complications that forced multiple delays. The storage facility where my furniture was being held temporarily experienced a paperwork mix-up that prevented access to items that were supposed to be delivered to my new location. The continuing care community itself had questions about my medical records and financial documentation that required additional meetings and verifications. None of these complications were individually serious enough to prevent my relocation, but collectively they created a steady stream of administrative tasks that demanded time and attention my children could ill afford given their professional crises. Every day spent dealing with moving logistics was a day they couldn't spend addressing the business problems that were threatening their careers and financial security. By mid-December, the cumulative stress was taking a visible toll on all three of them. Marcus had developed a nervous habit of checking his phone obsessively, hoping for good news from clients that never materialized. Diana snapped irritably at anyone who interrupted her while she was working, including family members who had legitimate questions about our moving timeline. Christopher had begun drinking more heavily in the evenings, using alcohol to manage anxiety about his deteriorating business prospects. The irony was breathtaking. 3 months earlier, they had been confident, successful professionals who felt qualified to make major life decisions for their aging mother. Now, they were struggling to manage their own affairs while maintaining the pretense that relocating me was still their top priority. The people who had insisted that I needed professional care and supervision were demonstrating that they couldn't handle unexpected pressure without falling apart themselves. But I wasn't satisfied with simply watching them struggle. The goal wasn't to destroy their careers or ruin their lives permanently. The goal was to teach them that their actions had consequences, that treating family members badly would result in unpleasant outcomes, and that they needed to fundamentally reassess their assumptions about power and respect within our family dynamic. The lesson wouldn't be complete until they understood the connection between their behavior toward me and the professional difficulties they were experiencing. They needed to realize that their problems weren't random bad luck or unfair persecution by mysterious enemies. They needed to understand that they were facing consequences for specific choices they had made about how to treat someone they claimed to love. As Christmas approached, I began preparing for the revelation that would transform our family relationships forever. My children thought they were managing a difficult but ultimately successful transition period that would soon result in my peaceful relocation to appropriate senior housing. They had no idea that their mother had been orchestrating every aspect of their recent troubles and was now ready to offer them a choice between genuine change and continued consequences. The basement where they had imprisoned me was about to become the setting for the most important conversation of their adult lives. They thought they were dealing with a helpless elderly woman who needed their protection and guidance. They were about to discover that they were dealing with someone who had finally decided to stop protecting them from the results of their own selfishness. The breaking point arrived on a snowy Thursday evening in late December, when all three of my children converged in the kitchen simultaneously, each carrying the weight of professional disasters that had reached critical mass. The house felt like a pressure cooker about to explode, filled with tension that none of them understood but all of them could feel. I emerged from the basement to find them huddled around the granite island, where I had once prepared countless family meals, their faces drawn with stress and their voices raised in frustrated arguments about problems that seemed to have no solutions. Marcus was pacing frantically while clutching his phone, his usually polished demeanor completely shattered. His consulting firm had lost 3 more major clients in the past week, and the remaining contracts were under review by nervous executives who seemed to be looking for excuses to terminate their relationships. The private investigators he had hired to identify his mysterious enemies had produced nothing but expensive bills and useless theories about corporate espionage that made no logical sense. Diana sat at the counter with her head in her hands, still wearing surgical scrubs from what had clearly been an exhausting day at the hospital. The compliance issues that had started as minor administrative concerns had escalated into a formal investigation by the medical center's board of directors. Questions about her family situation, professional judgment, and departmental management had evolved into whispered speculation about her fitness to continue leading the cardiac surgery program. Christopher leaned against the refrigerator with a drink in his hand, his usual confident swagger replaced by the defensive posture of someone whose world was collapsing in ways he couldn't explain or control. His real estate empire was crumbling as investor after investor withdrew from development projects, citing vague concerns about due diligence and risk assessment that made his most promising deals disappear overnight. "This can't be coincidence," Marcus was saying for what sounded like the 100th time. 3 successful professionals don't suddenly experience coordinated career destruction without someone orchestrating it. There has to be a connection we're missing. Diana looked up with red-rimmed eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and mounting panic. "The timing is too perfect. Everything started falling apart right around the time we began making arrangements for Mom's move. Maybe someone is targeting our family specifically." Christopher laughed bitterly, gesturing with his drink, in a way that suggested it wasn't his first of the evening. "Who would target us? And why? We're not important enough to justify this kind of elaborate revenge scheme. This is just spectacularly bad luck hitting all of us at once." I remained silent in the doorway, watching them struggle with a puzzle they couldn't solve because they refused to consider the most obvious explanation. Their complete inability to imagine that their powerless mother might be capable of influencing their professional lives was both insulting and strategically advantageous. They were so committed to viewing me as helpless that they couldn't recognize strength even when it was systematically dismantling their comfortable assumptions about the world. Marcus stopped pacing and turned to face his siblings with the desperate intensity of someone grasping for any theory that might explain his circumstances. What if it's connected to Mom's inheritance? Eleanor was in technology, right? Maybe she had enemies in the business world who are taking out their grudges on her family. The mention of Eleanor's name made my heart race, but I maintained my neutral expression while listening to them stumble toward a truth they weren't ready to accept. Diana nodded thoughtfully, seizing on any explanation that didn't require them to examine their own behavior. "That actually makes sense. Eleanor was involved in corporate security systems. She probably had access to sensitive information that could threaten powerful people." Christopher set down his drink and pulled out his phone with renewed energy. "We need to research Eleanor's business relationships and find out who might have motives for revenge. If someone is using her technology connections to destroy our careers, we need to identify them and fight back." I almost smiled at their determination to find external enemies rather than consider internal accountability. They were willing to investigate elaborate conspiracy theories and spend money on private detectives, but they couldn't spare a moment to reflect on whether their own actions might have consequences. The possibility that treating their mother badly might result in unpleasant outcomes was so foreign to their thinking that they couldn't even consider it as a hypothesis. But their investigation into Eleanor's business relationships was actually going to accelerate the timeline for revelation, because any serious research into Blackwood Industries would eventually lead them to discover that Eleanor's sister, Victoria, was now the sole owner of the technology empire that was making their lives miserable. They were about to stumble onto the truth through their own desperate attempts to avoid taking responsibility for their situation. "I'll hire a forensic accountant to trace Eleanor's business connections," Marcus announced with the false confidence of someone who thought he was finally taking productive action. "If there's a financial motive behind our problems, we'll find it." Diana stood up and smoothed her scrubs with hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion and stress. "I'll contact some colleagues who work in corporate security. They might have insights about technology companies and how they could be weaponized against individuals." Christopher was already scrolling through contacts on his phone. "I know some people in the financial sector who understand how business relationships can be manipulated. If someone is using economic pressure to target our family, they'll know how to trace it back to the source." As they made their plans to investigate the mystery of their professional destruction, I quietly retreated to the basement where Patricia Reynolds was waiting for a scheduled video conference. The time had come to prepare for the revelation that would transform our family dynamics forever. My children were finally asking the right questions, and they were about to get answers they weren't expecting. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Patricia said when I connected to the secure call, "Samuel tells me that your children are beginning to investigate Blackwood Industries. How do you want to handle the inevitable discovery of your ownership?" I settled into my chair and considered the options that Patricia and I had discussed extensively over the past month. The goal was never to destroy my children permanently, but rather to shock them into recognizing that their actions had serious consequences and that they needed to fundamentally change their approach to family relationships. The revelation of my ownership of Blackwood Industries would be most effective if it came at a moment when they were already vulnerable and questioning their assumptions about the world. Let them discover the connection, I decided. When they realize that their mother owns the company that's been creating their professional difficulties, they'll be forced to confront the relationship between their behavior toward me and the consequences they've been experiencing. That recognition is essential for genuine change to occur. Patricia nodded approvingly. "And the trust documents? Are you ready to present those as well?" The family trust that Patricia had helped me establish represented both carrot and stick in the most important negotiation of my life. My children could inherit substantial benefits from Eleanor's estate, but only if they demonstrated genuine respect for family relationships and commitment to treating elderly relatives with dignity, rather than viewing them as burdens to be managed. The trust provided positive incentives for behavior change while also making clear that continued selfishness would result in permanent financial consequences. Yes, they need to understand that their inheritance isn't guaranteed. It's contingent on proving that they've learned from this experience and genuinely changed their attitudes about family responsibility. The trust documents spelled out specific requirements for maintaining family relationships, including regular, meaningful contact, inclusion in major family decisions, and respect for the autonomy and dignity of elderly relatives. Over the weekend, my children threw themselves into investigating Eleanor's business empire with the same intensity they had once devoted to planning my relocation. Marcus hired expensive forensic accountants to trace financial relationships and identify potential enemies. Diana consulted with cybersecurity experts about corporate espionage and technology-based revenge schemes. Christopher reached out to business contacts who might understand how financial pressure could be used to target specific individuals. Their investigation was thorough, professional, and ultimately futile because they were looking for external threats rather than examining internal accountability. But the process of researching Blackwood Industries inevitably led them to discover public records showing recent changes in corporate ownership and control. By Monday morning, they had uncovered the shocking truth that Eleanor Blackwood's entire technology empire had been inherited by her sister, Victoria Hawthorne. The moment of discovery occurred in my kitchen while I was preparing what I assumed would be another solitary breakfast. Marcus burst through the front door carrying a thick folder of documents, his face pale with the kind of shock that comes from having fundamental assumptions about reality suddenly overturned. Diana and Christopher arrived within minutes, clearly, summoned by urgent phone calls that had disrupted their morning routines. "Mom," Marcus said, his voice carrying a tremor I had never heard before. "We need to talk to you. Right now." The authority and condescension that usually characterized his interactions with me had been replaced by something approaching fear. For the first time in months, he was looking at me as if I were a real person, rather than a problem to be managed. Diana spread documents across the kitchen counter with hands that shook slightly from adrenaline and disbelief. "These are corporate filings for Blackwood Industries, showing ownership transfer following Eleanor's death. According to these records, you inherited everything, the entire company." Christopher was staring at me with the expression of someone trying to reconcile incompatible pieces of information. "Mom, Blackwood Industries is worth tens of millions of dollars. Their client list includes every major bank in the region, dozens of hospitals and medical centers, and hundreds of corporations that depend on their security systems. I looked at each of my children calmly, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and sadness that this moment had finally arrived. Satisfaction because they were finally being forced to confront the reality of their situation. Sadness because it had taken such extreme measures to get their attention and make them consider the possibility that their mother deserved better treatment than they had been providing. Yes, I said simply. Eleanor left me everything when she died. The company, the patents, the contracts, all of it. The words hung in the air like an explosion, whose shockwaves were still reverberating through their understanding of our family dynamics. Marcus sat down heavily, still clutching the documents as if they might change if he held them tightly enough. But you never said anything. When we were making plans for your living situation, when we were discussing your financial needs, you never mentioned inheriting a fortune. You never asked, I replied. You made assumptions about my capabilities and resources without consulting me about my actual circumstances. You decided what was best for me without considering whether I might have preferences or options that differed from your plans. Diana was scanning through financial reports with the focused intensity she usually reserved for complex surgical procedures. These revenue figures show that Blackwood Industries generates millions of dollars annually. You're not just wealthy, you're powerful in ways that could influence major corporations and institutions. The recognition of my power was clearly difficult for them to process. For months, they had viewed me as someone who needed their protection and guidance. The discovery that I controlled resources far greater than their own combined wealth was forcing them to completely reassess our family hierarchy and their own positions within it. Christopher was connecting the dots with the analytical skills that had made him successful in real estate development. The business reviews that have been causing problems for our clients, the enhanced compliance requirements that have been making our professional lives miserable. Those all came from Blackwood Industries. From you. I nodded slowly, watching them absorb the implications of what they were discovering. Your professional difficulties aren't random bad luck or persecution by mysterious enemies. They're consequences of specific choices you made about how to treat someone you claim to love, but have been treating like an inconvenient burden. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. My children were being forced to confront the direct connection between their behavior toward me and the professional crises that had been consuming their lives for the past month. The experience of being judged and found wanting by their own mother was entirely new to them, and they clearly didn't know how to process it. Marcus finally found his voice, though it sounded strained and uncertain. So everything that's been happening to us, the lost clients, the compliance investigations, the investor problems, you've been orchestrating all of it? I've been creating natural consequences for your actions, I corrected. You decided that I was too much of a burden for your busy lives, so you forced me to live in the basement while strangers took over my home. You made plans to sell my house and relocate me against my will without considering my preferences or consulting me about alternatives. You treated me like someone whose opinions and desires didn't matter. Diana was crying now, though whether from shame, anger, or simple overwhelming stress was unclear. But we thought we were helping you. We thought we were making sure you were safe and properly cared for. You thought you were solving a problem that was inconveniencing your comfortable lives, I replied. You weren't interested in what would make me happy or fulfilled in my remaining years. You were interested in what would require the least disruption to your own schedules and priorities. Christopher had been unusually quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke with a voice that sounded younger and more vulnerable than his usual confident persona. What happens now, Mom? What do you want from us? The question I had been waiting for had finally been asked. My children were ready to listen because they no longer had any choice. They could no longer dismiss my concerns or override my preferences. because they had finally recognized that I held the power to make their lives extremely difficult if they continued treating me badly. I want you to understand that love isn't just a feeling, I said, looking at each of them in turn. Love is a choice you make every day about how to treat the people who matter to you. For months, you've been choosing to treat me like a burden rather than a blessing, like a problem rather than a person you care about. I stood up and walked to the window where I could see the garden I had cultivated for 30 years, now dormant, under December snow but waiting for spring to bloom again. I want you to choose differently. I want you to remember that I'm not just your mother who raised you and sacrificed for you. I'm a human being who deserves to be consulted about decisions that affect my life, who deserves to have my preferences considered and my autonomy respected. When I turned back to face them, I saw something in their expressions that I hadn't seen in years: genuine attention. They were finally listening to me, not because they had to endure my presence, but because they wanted to understand what I was telling them. There's something else you need to know, I continued, pulling out the trust documents that Patricia had prepared. Your inheritance from Eleanor's estate isn't automatic. It's contingent on proving that you've learned from this experience and genuinely changed your approach to family relationships. The trust documents outlined specific requirements for beneficiaries, including regular, meaningful contact with elderly family members, inclusion of those family members in decisions that affected them, and demonstrated respect for their autonomy and dignity. The financial benefits were substantial, but they required ongoing commitment to treating family relationships as priorities rather than conveniences. As my children absorbed this final revelation, I realized that we had reached the moment of truth that would determine whether our family could be rebuilt or whether the damage they had inflicted was irreparable. They now understood the full scope of my power and the direct connection between their behavior and its consequences. The question was whether they would choose to change genuinely or simply perform the behaviors required to secure their inheritance. The next few minutes would reveal who my children truly were beneath their successful professional facades, and whether the people I had raised and loved were still capable of growth, humility, and authentic care for someone other than themselves. The silence that followed my revelation stretched across the kitchen like a chasm that none of us knew how to bridge. My 3 children sat frozen around the granite counter, staring at the trust documents as if they contained a foreign language they couldn't decipher. The magnitude of their miscalculation was finally hitting them with the force of an avalanche, burying their comfortable assumptions about family hierarchy beneath the crushing weight of reality. Marcus was the first to break the silence, his voice hoarse with disbelief. You've been planning this whole thing. From the moment we told you about Golden Sunset Village, you knew exactly how you were going to respond. His accusation carried a note of admiration mixed with fear, as if he was finally recognizing that his mother possessed strategic thinking abilities he had never credited her with. I settled back into the chair where I had once held family, meetings about homework and household rules, feeling the strange comfort of occupying my proper place at the head of our family dynamic. I hoped it wouldn't be necessary. Even after Eleanor's warning, even after receiving her inheritance, I hoped that my own children would surprise me by showing genuine concern for my happiness, rather than just solving their own logistical problems. Diana wiped tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand, smearing her carefully applied makeup in a way that made her look younger and more vulnerable. Eleanor warned you about us? Her own nieces and nephew? The hurt in her voice was genuine, but it was the hurt of someone discovering that other people could see flaws in her character that she had hidden from herself. Eleanor loved all of you, I said gently, but she wasn't blind to what you had become. She watched you grow increasingly impatient with family obligations, increasingly focused on your own success at the expense of maintaining meaningful relationships. She saw patterns that I was too loving to acknowledge. Christopher stood up abruptly and began pacing around the kitchen island, his nervous energy seeking an outlet that didn't exist. So what now? Do we grovel and beg for forgiveness? Do we promise to be better children and hope you'll call off the attack on our careers? His tone carried the bitter edge of someone who felt manipulated, even though he was beginning to understand that the manipulation was a response to his own callous behavior. "This isn't about groveling," I replied firmly. "This is about genuine recognition that your actions have consequences and that treating family members badly will result in unpleasant outcomes. You can't just promise to be better and expect everything to return to the way it was." Marcus leaned forward with the intense focus he usually reserved for important business negotiations. "Then what do you want from us? Specifically, what would it take for you to undo the damage you've done to our professional relationships?" The question revealed that he still didn't understand the fundamental nature of what needed to change. He was looking for a transaction, a deal he could negotiate that would restore his comfortable position without requiring genuine transformation of his character or priorities. This transactional approach to family relationships was exactly the problem that had led to our current crisis. "I want you to understand that love isn't a business deal," I said, studying each of their faces carefully. "You can't negotiate your way back into my good graces by offering to visit more often or call more frequently. You need to fundamentally change how you think about family relationships and your obligations to the people who raised you and sacrificed for you." Diana pulled the trust documents closer and began reading through the specific requirements, with the clinical attention she brought to complex medical procedures. These stipulations about regular contact and inclusion in family decisions, they're not just suggestions, are they? They're legally binding conditions for receiving any inheritance. "Absolutely," I confirmed. "Patricia Reynolds has structured the trust so that benefits are contingent on demonstrated commitment to family relationships. If you revert to your old patterns of treating me like an inconvenient burden, the trust can redirect Eleanor's fortune to charitable organizations that support elderly care and family relationship counseling." Christopher stopped pacing and turned to face me with an expression that mixed respect with resentment. "You've thought of everything, haven't you? Professional consequences for treating you badly, financial incentives for treating you well, legal structures to ensure we can't just fake compliance until you die and leave us everything anyway." The crude reference to my mortality stung, but it also revealed the calculating mindset that had allowed them to treat me so poorly in the first place. They had been making decisions based on the assumption that they only needed to endure my presence for a limited time before inheriting whatever assets I possessed. The discovery that my assets were far larger than they had imagined, and that access to those assets required ongoing respectful behavior, was forcing them to reconsider their entire approach to our relationship. "I've thought about the kind of family I want to be part of during my remaining years," I said. "I've thought about whether I want to spend that time feeling loved and valued, or feeling like a burden that my own children are grudgingly managing until I'm gone." The emotional weight of those words hit them differently than the financial and professional revelations had. For the first time since this conversation began, they seemed to be considering my experience rather than just calculating their own losses and potential gains. Diana's tears intensified, and even Marcus's controlled expression cracked slightly. "Mom," Diana whispered, "we never meant to make you feel like a burden. We thought we were taking care of you, making sure you were safe and properly supervised." "You thought you were checking items off a list of filial duties," I corrected. "You thought that arranging appropriate housing and medical care fulfilled your obligations to me. You never considered whether your arrangements would make me happy, or fulfilled, or connected to the people and places I love." Christopher returned to his seat at the counter, his restless energy finally exhausted. "So what happens now? Do we start over? Do we pretend the last few months never happened?" "We acknowledge what happened and why it happened," I said. "We recognize that you made choices based on what was convenient for you rather than what was best for our family relationships. We commit to making different choices going forward." Marcus was studying the trust documents with the thorough attention he brought to complex contracts. These requirements aren't just about visiting more often or calling more regularly. They're about including you in major family decisions, consulting you about your own care needs, treating you as an equal partner in family planning rather than someone whose preferences are optional. Exactly, I said. I don't want to be visited like a duty. I want to be included like a person whose opinions and desires matter. I want to be consulted about decisions that affect my life rather than simply informed about arrangements other people have made for me. Diana looked up from her own review of the documents. The trust also includes provisions for supporting other elderly family members and funding programs that help families maintain connections across generations. This isn't just about our immediate family. It's about changing how society treats aging relatives. The broader implications of Eleanor's legacy were indeed part of my long-term vision. The technology empire she had built could fund research into better elder care models, support families who were struggling to balance caregiving with other responsibilities, and promote policies that prioritized dignity and autonomy for aging individuals. But those larger goals would only be achievable if my own family could demonstrate that genuine change was possible. Eleanor believed that individual family transformation could model broader social change, I explained. If successful, accomplished people like yourselves can learn to prioritize family relationships over professional convenience, then other families facing similar challenges might be inspired to make different choices. The conversation continued for hours as my children absorbed the full implications of what they had discovered. They asked detailed questions about the trust requirements, the timeline for demonstrating compliance, and the specific behaviors that would be considered evidence of genuine change versus superficial performance. Their analytical approach to the problem revealed both their continued inability to fully grasp the emotional dimensions of what needed to change and their genuine desire to find a path forward that would preserve our family relationships. As afternoon turned to evening, something fundamental shifted in the way they spoke to me and about me. The condescending tone that had characterized their interactions for months was replaced by something approaching respect. They began asking about my preferences rather than announcing their decisions. They inquired about my comfort and happiness rather than focusing exclusively on logistics and arrangements. The change wasn't complete or entirely natural yet, but it was noticeable enough to give me hope that genuine transformation might be possible. Marcus suggested that we cancel the arrangements at Golden Sunset Village and explore alternatives that would allow me to remain in my own home while receiving any support services I actually wanted. Diana offered to modify her work schedule to spend more time with me, not as a caregiver, but as a daughter who wanted to maintain a close relationship with her mother. Christopher proposed that we work together to renovate parts of the house, to better accommodate aging while preserving the dignity and independence that were clearly important to me. These suggestions represented a fundamental shift from their previous approach of making decisions for me to making decisions with me. They were finally recognizing that my preferences and desires were legitimate factors that needed to be considered in any plans that affected my life. The transformation from viewing me as a problem to be managed to viewing me as a person to be consulted was exactly what I had been trying to achieve through all of the strategic pressure I had applied to their professional lives. But the most significant moment came when Marcus asked a question that revealed genuine understanding of what this experience had taught him. "Mom, how do we make sure we never put you in this position again? How do we build the kind of family relationships that don't require dramatic interventions to maintain basic respect and consideration?" The question showed that he was finally thinking beyond the immediate crisis to the larger patterns that needed to change. He was recognizing that this wasn't just about undoing specific bad decisions, but about developing new habits and priorities that would prevent similar problems from arising in the future. We start by remembering that family relationships require ongoing investment, not just crisis management, I said. We make time for each other when things are going well, not just when problems arise. We include each other in our lives as people we genuinely enjoy spending time with, not just as obligations we need to fulfill. Diana nodded thoughtfully. And we remember that your needs and preferences matter just as much as ours do. We can't make major decisions about your life without consulting you, even if we think we know what's best for you. Christopher added, we also need to remember that being successful professionally doesn't give us the right to dismiss other people's concerns or override their choices. Success should make us more generous and considerate, not more entitled and controlling. These insights gave me genuine hope that the painful lessons of the past few months might result in lasting positive changes rather than temporary compliance, motivated primarily by financial incentives. My children were demonstrating the kind of self-reflection and commitment to growth that suggested they might be capable of rebuilding our family relationships on a foundation of mutual respect rather than hierarchical control. Over the following weeks, they proved their sincerity through actions rather than just words. Marcus withdrew the listing for my house and hired contractors to make modifications that would enhance safety and comfort while preserving my independence and autonomy. Diana reduced her surgical schedule to spend regular time with me, not monitoring my health or managing my care, but simply enjoying conversation and shared activities that we both found meaningful. Christopher used his real estate expertise to explore options for creating additional living spaces that would allow family members to be nearby without sacrificing privacy or independence. More importantly, they began including me in their own lives in ways that hadn't happened for years. They sought my advice about professional challenges, shared their concerns about their children's development, and invited me to participate in family celebrations and gatherings as an honored guest, rather than someone who needed to be accommodated. The transformation from viewing me as a burden to viewing me as a resource and companion was exactly what I had hoped to achieve. The business pressures that had created their professional crises were gradually reduced as they demonstrated genuine commitment to family relationship improvement. Clients who had been concerned about their stability and reliability began receiving positive reports about their character and integrity. Investors who had questioned their judgment and priorities discovered evidence of mature decision-making and strong family values. The professional consequences that had motivated their initial attention to the problem evolved into professional benefits as their improved family relationships enhanced their reputations and credibility. 6 months after the revelation that transformed our family dynamics, we celebrated Eleanor's birthday together in the garden she had helped me design decades earlier. My children brought their own children, creating a multi-generational gathering that honored both Eleanor's memory and the renewed connections she had made possible through her strategic generosity. The trust fund that had initially seemed like a threat had become a blessing that funded family activities, educational opportunities for the grandchildren, and charitable programs that supported other families facing similar challenges. As I watched my children interact with their own children, that afternoon, I saw evidence that the lessons they had learned were being passed down to the next generation. They were modeling respectful communication, inclusive decision-making, and genuine appreciation for the wisdom and experience that older family members could contribute. The grandchildren were learning that aging relatives were resources to be treasured, rather than problems to be managed. The most satisfying moment came when Marcus's teenage son asked me about Eleanor's technology innovations and how they had changed industries and improved people's lives. As I shared stories about my sister's brilliance and determination, I realized that Eleanor's true legacy wasn't just the financial resources she had left behind, but the family connections she had forced us to rebuild and strengthen. The basement where I had spent those difficult months had been transformed into a family media room where multiple generations gathered to watch movies, play games, and share stories. The space that had once symbolized my exile and diminishment had become a center for family connection and joy. The reversal felt symbolic of everything that had changed in our relationships and our understanding of what truly mattered. Standing in my garden that evening, surrounded by children and grandchildren who genuinely valued my presence and contributions, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from fighting for something important and winning completely. I had demanded respect and received love. I had insisted on dignity and gained influence. I had refused to accept unacceptable treatment and created a family dynamic based on mutual appreciation rather than hierarchical control. Eleanor had been right about the power of strategic intervention and the importance of demanding better treatment from people who claim to love you. But she had also been right about something even more important: that genuine transformation was possible when people were motivated by consequences that mattered to them and supported by structures that rewarded positive change. The woman who had once slept in the basement like an unwanted animal had become the matriarch of a family that understood the true meaning of respect, love, and legacy, and that transformation had benefited everyone involved, creating connections and possibilities that wouldn't have existed if I had accepted their original plan for my quiet disappearance into institutional care. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give ungrateful people is the opportunity to learn gratitude through experiencing the consequences of taking your love for granted. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the courage to demand the treatment you deserve, even when doing so requires strategic thinking and patient execution that others underestimate at their own peril. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.